I'm Joshua Knobe from Yale University.
And I'm Abby Marsh from Georgetown University.
So, Abby, it seems like you've spent most of your life studying some of the cruelest, most callous, most remorseless people in our society. But then just in the past few years, you kind of switched your research program around to studying some of the most altruistic, self-sacrificing people in our society. So it seems like your plan has been to kind of take this research on what makes people so merciless and sort of transform it into studying what can make people so merciful.
Yeah, and I would say, more accurately, I've really been broadening my research. I still study people who are at the low end of the spectrum, but it just occurred to me more recently that if you're interested in studying what makes people care about other people, you can either study people who don't care about other people at all, or you can study people who seem to care about other people a lot, and use either one of those as tools to try to understand what's going on.
So let's talk first about people who don't care about people at all. So a lot of your research has been on children with psychopathic tendencies. So do you think you could tell us a little bit about what you've discovered about them?
Sure. So the work that I did and have done on kids who have psychopathic traits started at the NIH in 2004. So I've been doing that work for over 10 years now. And we find kids in the community whose parents usually just respond to ads that we post. People often ask, how do you find these kids who have psychopathic traits? And it's not that hard. They're, 1 to 3% of the population. So that's actually a lot of kids out there. And we post flyers that say, does your child have serious behavior problems and not feel guilty when they do something wrong? And about half the time, if a parent calls in and said, yep, that's my kid, they have what we call in kids psychopathic traits or callous unemotional traits, which just means that they're callous. They don't have any empathy. They don't feel any guilt. And we call them unemotional, but it doesn't seem to be that they're unemotional always, right? They have horrible temper tantrums and they can get really excited about things, but they do seem to be lacking in fear. And the research that we've done is both behavioral and brain imaging. We've done a lot of MRI studies on the kids now, looking at how their brain function differs from healthy kids. And a lot of their problems seem to relate to dysfunction in the amygdala, which is this little subcortical structure that is responsible for lots of different emotional and social processes.
Can you just tell us a little bit about what it's like to with these children with psychopathic traits? So how are they different from other children?
How are they different from other kids? Yeah, they, what's interesting about them is that you wouldn't know that they're different from other kids by just talking to them. If I were to line up, all of my kids who have psychopathic traits in a room with all of our healthy control kids, you'd never know who was who. For the most part, all of the kids that we've worked with, even the ones who in their daily life do some pretty terrible things, are fun and interesting and lively, and I have really enjoyed talking to them. So what's interesting about them is how sort of narrow the differences between them and everybody else is. And that's sort of amazing that you can have these very small differences that result in these really significant behavior problems. One of their main differences, like I said, is that they seem to be sort of fearless. They engage in behavior that's incredibly dangerous, and they don't seem to have any fear for their own safety. And that's very consistent with what we know about adult psychopaths, who will sometimes, when you ask them what it feels like to be afraid, it's like they're drawing a blank. They're like, I don't understand what you mean. Like, what are you talking about? When someone sticks a gun in my face, I don't know. I guess I would try to, take over what's going on, or I guess I'd try to get out of there. But they really don't know how it feels. And in one study we did of I think it was 18 kids with psychopathic traits we studied between the ages of 10 and 17, and we asked them to tell us what it feels like to be afraid. And in general, the healthy kids tell you things like, yeah, your heart's pounding and your pulse is racing and you're breathing fast, your hands are sweating, and all the normal things that people say it feels like to be afraid. And the kids who have psychopathic traits just don't report feeling much of any of that. The way that they report fear feeling isn't any different from any other emotion. And some of them actually told us that they've never been afraid. They're like, nah, never felt that emotion before, I can't tell you, which is not what healthy kids say at all.
They don't even really know what it is. They don't even really understand what it is to you.
Yeah, it's just they don't, and I think the evidence suggests that it's because they have this significant amygdala dysfunction that they, the process that's supposed to happen in between when you perceive a threat in the environment And then your amygdala sends a signal to the other parts of your brain that say, okay, let's get in gear and get out of here before this horrible thing happens to us. And it creates this feeling that motivates you to save yourself. And they don't seem to get that feeling, at least not very strongly.
Hey, you mentioned before that these kids you're working with can be really fun. But do you think this is connected to the funness? I mean, when you describe this person, it seems like in some ways a really terrifying person to be with, but in some ways a really fun person to be with.
Yeah. I mean, it's this sort of good and bad thing about them is that I think their lack of fear does make them fun and charming a lot of the time because, at least for some people, if they're not charming or fun in a social situation, it's because they're too nervous, right? They're feeling inhibited. And if you let those inhibitions go, whether it's by drinking too much or whatever, then they're fun and lively. And so if you have no fear of what might happen, if you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, then I think that's where some of that charisma comes from for sure. But the problem with that is that it's not like they seem fun, like, slimy salesman fun. They seem legitimately fun. And, people who are potentially dangerous because, for example, they're psychotic, it's really easy to tell that there's a problem. And so you can take appropriate action. Like not getting too close to them when they seem like they're having trouble. But for kids who are callous and unemotional, there's no sign that there's a problem, right? And they tend to be very good at manipulating people. And one of the really common confusions is because they don't have empathy. Some people sort of confuse that with what we mean by empathy when we talk about autism, like theory of mind. But people who are psychopathic are very good manipulators, which suggests they have very good theory of mind, or at least they can. And so they're often actively manipulating your impression of them. That's part of their skill. And we even had some kids. We had one girl who was very articulate about the ways that she would manipulate people's impressions of her. She would talk to some adults. This was always when she was in trouble, which she always was. And, some adults, she said, seemed to be really impressed if she used big words. And so when she was trying to get out of trouble, she would be very articulate and use lots of really, big, I don't know what they call them, 50-cent words. And other adults would not be impressed by that. They would be much more impressed if she cried. And so she was good at crying on purpose to try to get out of trouble with other people. And she was quite articulate about exactly, what different strategies she'd use to get out of trouble to seem the most compellingly, remorseful and like she wasn't going to do it again. And so, very good manipulator, very good theory of mind, but very actually sort of indifferent to other people's welfare in reality.
Do you think that there's any explanation of why people with this kind of disorder are better at being manipulators? It seems like if you actually did feel remorseful, you might think that would make you a better actor. You'd be better at faking remorse if you actually were capable of remorse. But it almost seems like you're saying the opposite, that it's precisely the people who are incapable of real remorse that have mastered this like thespian thing where they pretend to be remorseful and they don't feel anything at all.
Well, it's a great question. I think it's easier to fake emotions if you don't have real emotion interfering with what's going on. And I think that that's sometimes true for them. They're able to fake what they're feeling because there's no real feelings under the surface that they're having to cover up, at least when it comes to things like empathy and remorse, which they really don't have. Or, we talk about having conflicted emotions and it's hard to know how to act. I don't think they have conflicting emotions that often.
Maybe this might seem like a silly metaphor, but it's like you're trying to create a drawing. You might want to start out with a paper that's completely white. It doesn't just have anything on it. Because you could sort of starting with nothing, it's easier to draw something on it. If you have already all the stuff on it, it'd be hard to break the drawing. Or maybe exactly the same thing is true with emotions. If you have all sorts of real emotions that are conflicting and pulling you in different directions, it's difficult to create fake emotions on top of them. But if you have nothing under it, then it's just a blank slate. It's very easy to write like whatever you want.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. And I think, again, when you're missing emotions like fear and anxiety, you're not as, those emotions can make you self-focused sometimes, right? If you're very worried about your own outcomes and you're not paying as much attention to other people. But if you're not as worried about your own outcomes, then you can be paying attention a lot to other people and picking up hints of how people normally behave in that kind of situation in order to try to crib together a false impression of caring. And I know that Ted Bundy, who's from my hometown of Tacoma, Washington, and also the psychopathy researcher Kent Keel, we all grew up within about a 4-mile radius. Ted Bundy was obviously much worse than the average psychopath. That's, he's like the worst person who's ever lived in this country, maybe. And he was known when he was an adult for being the classic charismatic psychopath, glib, and, told these very deft stories that would sucker people in, and then he would kill them. But when he was younger, he was not that socially skilled, and he really talks about how he just studied people. He would sort of, pay attention to what people did and said, and he would use the things that he learned to seem like a sincere person himself later on. And he got away with all kinds of crazy shoplifting at Nordstrom when he was in college, by seeming very debonair. And he was very good at seeming to be who he wasn't, and talked about studying. And he especially talked about how he didn't know what made other people care about other people. He really just didn't. And he founded this like immense puzzle, why other people seem to care and to form relationships and friendships. And so he just put on the appearance of doing so without really knowing why.
So maybe it's almost like those of us who really do care about other people, that caring just gets in the way of our ability to act like we care about other people. Because we spend so much time caring about other people that we haven't learned how to put on the right facial expression that sort of conveys, like, I care about other people.
Maybe. Maybe some people are really good at being just naturally, because it is true that some people are just naturally very expressive. And we tend to like people who are very expressive. We like to know what people are thinking and feeling. And so people who are, whose emotions are big and all over their face and body, we warm to them. But other people are not like that naturally. And so they probably have to learn to be more clear or more expressive. But I think for them, it's more challenging than for people who are psychopathic, because, right, just like you say, they're not burdened by these actual emotions that they're having to sort of override, ignore, and get out of the way of. They're just painting on sort of a blank slate.
So I think a lot of people have the sense that the reason maybe that someone becomes a psychopath is that something not happens to them, Dexter or something. There's some sort of childhood trauma that makes people into this. So is that what you find with these kids? Did anything bad happen to them that caused this problem?
So, this is the nature-nurture question, right? This is a really difficult puzzle, but luckily there have been enough behavior genetic studies, twin studies and that kind of thing, that we have a pretty good sense. So it is true that if you have a kid who's been really mistreated as a kid, abused or neglected or just really low quality parenting, that's not good, right? That they're certainly going to have behavior problems going forward, but they're not going to be the kids who are psychopathic. They're going to be the kids who have conduct problems, like conduct disorder, because they have, in some senses, probably too much emotion, right? They're very vigilant for danger, especially if they've been abused. They might be really dysregulated if they've been neglected, and they're in some ways more emotionally reactive. They have a lot of temper tantrums. They react to sort of ambiguous cues as though they're threats because they're expecting threats all the time. So that's one class of kids who have behavior problems. Kids who are psychopathic are not like that. It seems to be that psychopathy is really strongly inherited. So as much as 70 or 80% even of the symptoms are due to genetics, we think. And so it is sometimes the case that kids who have psychopathic traits don't have a great home, but we don't think that's why they are the way they are. We think that, that in any home they would have come out roughly the same, unfortunately.
I guess if it's very heritable, you'd expect that psychopaths would be really often abused just because their parents are psychopaths.
Well, right. That's the whole correlation versus causation problem. So we think that, if you have genuinely psychopathic traits, probably at least one of your parents does too. So they're probably not a great parent, but any problems of the way they were treating you is not the reason you are the way you are. The reason you are the way you are is because you and your bad parents share these genes that make you aggressive and callous and not a very nice person.
there's also sort of something in our ordinary notion of psychopaths, our kind of folk understanding, that's kind of like this Darth Vader vision. So, I don't know, like at least in the original series of Darth Vader, he seemed like this terrible guy, but then in the very last scene, it's revealed deep down within him, there's this throbbing, golden jewel of a heart that sort of reaches out for goodness. So, is there any truth to that? Is it that if only we could plant it deep down into these people's hearts, we'd find that compassion that's missing on the surface?
It's not, unfortunately. Now, I think it is possible that there are some people that you think are psychopathic, and it turns out they're not. They just put on a really good facade. And I think this is particularly true for kids from really difficult backgrounds. I'm thinking in particular of I think he was the third kid that we ever did a scan on. And he was from a really tough part of the DC area, and he had a really terrible childhood in a lot of ways, just as disadvantaged as you can imagine. And he had terrible behavior problems. I mean, he would tell these incredible stories. Every time he turned around, it seemed like another gun was falling out of a bush into his lap, and he was committing a crime, and that he'd been shot. He'd shot other people, lots of theft, everything, right? And he, on the psychopathy checklist we used to assess the kids, he had a very high score. And we thought, great, we're set. So we scheduled him for his MRI scan, and he came, first time we scheduled him for an MRI scan, he came with his monitoring bracelet on his ankle. And at the NIH, we were not allowed to scan him with his monitoring bracelet. He offered to take it off. And we said, no, please let's not get in that kind of trouble. We'll just, when are you going to get it off? Come back then. So he came back. And we took him back into the scan facility. And that day, I think he came with his, it wasn't his mother. It was a cousin or something. And we brought him back into the scan facility, and he was 14 or 15. He was very tall, right? He was a large guy. And we sat him down, and we were explaining the scan to him, and he looked a little off somehow, and we weren't sure why. We talked to him a couple times up to that point, but he seemed off that day. And then we were like, all right, you ready to go? Let's get all the metal off your body, the usual thing. And he's moving really slowly, and we couldn't figure out what's going on. And he's like, I don't know if I want to do this today. I'm like, what do you mean you don't want to do this? It's never happened with kids who have psychopathic traits, right? They might get bored during the scan, but they're not scared to go on the scanner. And he's like, I don't know. I don't know. Can you bring my cousin in? I want to talk to my cousin. And his cousin, tried to come in and tell him it was okay. And my colleague and I had both had MRI scans ourselves. So we tried to tell him, this is what's going to happen. And I know it's a big machine, but, it's just a big camera. Really, it's not a big deal. And he balked and balked, and he was physically moving further from the door. And finally he's like, I'm sorry. I can't do it, guys. I'm really sorry. I thought I could do it. And he started crying, and it was the most heartbreaking thing. And he was like, I'm sorry, guys. I feel like I let you down. And he was like, big hugs when he was leaving. And we were like, oh my goodness, this guy is not who we thought he was, right? He put on such a big show of being this really tough character, and he wasn't that at all. So I would say he is a really good example of the person who is putting on a true facade and who has, I think, a good heart. And I wouldn't be surprised if he's living a nice life now. I don't know where he is, but it wouldn't surprise me either way. Things could have gone really badly, but things could have turned out well. I hope they did. The kids who were genuinely have psychopathic traits, that's not the case for them. That, you peel off the mask and there's just, a kid who genuinely doesn't care about other people in there. And it's not because they're angry. It's not because they're sadistic. It's not like they want to hurt other people. It's just that they want what they want. And if they have to hurt other people to get it, well, it just doesn't matter.
So you mentioned that you were bringing these people into the scanner. So can you say a little bit about what you discovered? So what actually happened?
So one of the things that have been noticed about people who were psychopathic for a long time is that they have, again, these very sort of specific deficits interpersonally. So, for example, in recognizing other people's emotions. So you show people the basic facial expressions of emotion: anger, disgust, happiness, sadness, fear. And people who are psychopathic do fine with most of them, but when it comes to fear, that's where they really have a problem, right? They tend to be really impaired in recognizing other people's fear.
So you're looking at a picture of someone afraid, they can't even tell what that person is doing. They're just like, what is that?
Meaning they look at it and they just are like, I have no clue what that is.
Is that what's happening?
Well, I mean, so what's interesting about psychopathy is that it's a continuum, right? And so you have Ted Bundy at the end. We'll call it a 40 because that's the top score you can get on the psychopathy scale. But most of the people we were studying, the kids that we were studying, right, they weren't incarcerated, right? They weren't in psychiatric inpatient facilities. They were 25s on the scale. So they, it's not like they had no idea, but they struggled. If it wasn't a really intense, clear emotion, they were like, they tended to confuse it with things like anger, or sometimes surprise. And this is really interesting because we know that people who have lesions in their amygdala also seem to have deficits in recognizing other people's fear, which is interesting because we know that the amygdala is a structure that you have to have intact to be able to experience fear. And so it would be neat if this same structure is responsible for generating your own experience of fear and recognizing it in other people, because that suggests that that's kind of this basic empathic process, that you have to be able to sort of reconstruct or simulate another person's emotion in order to recognize what they're feeling. And so if you have trouble specifically experiencing fear, so will you specifically have trouble recognizing it in other people, but not other things, right? Just fear. So all of this research that have been done behaviorally suggested that maybe the problem with people who are psychopathic is in the amygdala, right? They must not have an appropriate amygdala response when they see somebody else who's afraid. And so we did the first imaging study to actually look at that, where we had 12 kids with psychopathic traits come into the scanner. And we compared them with 12 healthy kids and 12 kids with just ADHD, who look a little bit like psychopathic kids in some ways in terms of like stimulation seeking and some behavior problems, but they're not callous. And we found what we hypothesized, which was that the control kids and the kids with ADHD show a normal increase in amygdala activity to fearful expressions, which again, there are a number of interpretations what that means, but it could be this empathic simulation process. And the kids who had psychopathic traits on average showed no increase in activity at all in the amygdala, which again is, we think, why they can't recognize it.
Do you think the reason that they engage in all these behaviors, like harming other people, is because they don't feel afraid? Or is it because they just don't even really understand that you're afraid?
Well, it's hard to know if right now we don't have the tools to figure this out, but the processes might be really deeply linked, right? If you have trouble generating an experience of fear yourself because of impairments in the amygdala, the processes in the amygdala that lead to a fear response, then it may be that that in order to recognize, somebody else looks at you like, and you have to figure out what they're feeling, like, how do you do that? You can do it like a computer would do it, which is like, oh, I know that there are forehead wrinkles, and I know that I can see the teeth and the eyes seem wider. And, people probably don't do that because we can get similar data even if we show the expressions subliminally, right? So it's probably this really rapid response, which we know the amygdala can give you a really rapid response to anything fear relevant. And so what may be happening is that the amygdala is when you see somebody else who's afraid, somehow it's generating a little blip of, oh, that's what fear feels like. And you're like, oh, fear. And again, this is all happening subconsciously, if this is what's happening. But without that process, without intact amygdala, they can't engage in that process. And so they're left kind of, maybe people who are psychopathic are left with like, oh, the eyes are kind of wide and the brows are up. And is that fear? I think that's fear from what I remember, right? But that's not how normally people recognize these expressions. And in fact, we do know that some people who are psychopathic really can't recognize fear at all. And one of my favorite stories, from one of my colleagues in essay writing, is when she was testing a psychopathic offender in prison, and she took him through the usual series of facial expressions, and he missed every single fear expression, which is really bad, even for somebody who's psychopathic. Normally, at least by chance, they get some. And he knew he was doing badly, and he got to the last fear expression in the set, and he looked at it, and he's like, I don't know what that expression is called, but I know that's what people look like right before I stab them. Right. So he's like, I've seen that expression before. I can even tell you where I've seen it. It's just nothing's coming to mind in terms of what a person feels like who looks that way. And the idea is that if you don't feel that way yourself, you can't reconstruct what that experience is like.
Wait, so with all that as the background, then you seem to have switched over to thinking about this very different kind of topic, almost the very opposite of thinking about the people who are especially self-sacrificing or kind topics.
And again, I would say broaden, because I'm still very interested in working with kids, but we're also interested in looking at people who seem to have more than the usual amount of empathy. And again, the research that I've done on psychopathy, and I should note that like a lot of my psychopathy research is done with college students, right? Again, if psychopathy is a continuum, you can find it anywhere, right? You can find it in kids who have serious behavior problems, and in them, understanding what's going on is a tool to see if we can help them, right? I mean, I view this very much as a mental health question, right? This is not looking to, jail people and throw away the key. This is like, how can we help them? How can we try to fix what's going on so they can live a productive life? But you can also find psychopathy in Georgetown students, right? And you find all the same processes, even if you're like in the middle of the spectrum. But if you're interested in understanding what causes people to care about other people, looking at the sort of negative side of the picture is one way to do it. Okay, let's see what happens when people have no empathy, when it's been, all but taken away. Now what's your brain look like? What can you do cognitively? What can't you do? But the other way to look at it would be, okay, well, let's try to find people who have more than the usual amount of empathy, who care for other people's welfare way more than average. What do they look like? And it struck me that what they might look like, I mean, if it really is this continuum, but people usually only talk about half the continuum. Here's a psychopath at the low end, and then here's normal. But in theory, if this really is a continuum, there should be another end too. And so maybe people who are unusually compassionate and really care about other people's welfare are kind of anti-psychopaths. They look the opposite of a psychopath.
Wait, so that's really something really striking that you should think not just that they would have more compassion in the normal sense, but just that when they see someone who's afraid in particular, there should be something that they're showing higher mental activation.
That's it, right. And so that would be the theory, right? That's true, right? If what we have identified, this amygdala response to fear, is intrinsic, right, is somehow essential to generating a feeling of compassion for people, then just like you see not enough of that in psychopaths, you should see extra of that in people who are altruistic, right? And so they should have a bigger amygdala response to fear. They should be better at recognizing it than the average person. And so, so we cast around a little bit. We were like, who would these people be? Who would be these extra compassionate people? Because happily, there are a lot of compassionate people in the world. But it's hard to know for any given person. Let's say I've been asked, for example, why didn't I look at like firefighters, right? Because firefighters help people. They save people's lives, obviously. Isn't that compassionate? It's like, well, sure, it totally could be. And I'm sure that for many firefighters it is. But for other firefighters, I mean, they are getting paid, right? The job. So if you happen to be a very physically fit, strong person, it might just be a good way to earn some money. Or maybe you just like excitement. Maybe you're a stimulation seeker. And saving people is a good part of your job, but it's not really why you're doing it. Or maybe, and there's a very small subsample of firefighters who are actually also arsonists who just want to fire, right? I mean, like there's small. Anyways, it's complex why people go into firefighting, for example. So the group that we came up with was people who are very altruistic in that they have donated a kidney to a stranger. And it seems to me that this is a behavior that is hard to explain from any other angle other than they're very compassionate, right? They're like, these people are suffering. There are all these people who need a kidney and they're on dialysis and they're living these terrible lives waiting for a kidney. I have two. I don't need two. I'm going to give them one I want. And then,
so these people don't even know the person in any way. Did you even get a chance to meet the person?
And so the most extreme example of this is what are called non-directed kidney donors. They used to be called altruistic, but now it's non-directed, where they don't even say who they want their kidney to go to. They're like, I know that there's this waiting list. You pick. They go to the transplant center and they say, you pick who my kidney goes to. I don't care. Anybody you want. Sometimes they can specify whether it goes to a child or an adult, but other than that, they can't specify. And usually not even that. And they sign up for surgery. Their kidney gets taken out. It gets whisked somewhere else, put into somebody else, and they agree when they donate that they may never meet this person. If the recipient then wants to meet them and the donor wants to meet the recipient, then they can meet after the surgery. But in these donations, they go in with the understanding that they may never even meet the recipient, and in some cases they don't.
So how do people get into this? What's the path someone takes to going into surgery to help someone with never come back?
So what's the path that they take to do this?
Or what is it that people start thinking or feeling that makes them want to do that? Is it that they typically knew someone who had this problem? felt bad about it, or is it just that they just start thinking about all the suffering there is in this world and just think, well, I should just do my part. I guess I'm going to give away a kidney.
Yeah, it's a great question. There's not one answer for all of them because, they've arrived at the same place through multiple paths. We did ask them when we brought 20 kidney donors in for our study, 19. We asked them a lot of these questions. We asked the question for a lot of them, do you know somebody with kidney failure or who's received a kidney donation or who's given a kidney? And of course, all of them know somebody who's given a kidney away now because there are networks of living donors. But for most of them, at the time they decided to donate, the majority of them did not know anybody who'd had a kidney transplant, giving or receiving, didn't know anybody with kidney failure. I would say that the most common reason given for donating was that they had seen an ad or they'd seen like a media story on somebody who'd received kidney donation from an altruistic donor. And they, prior to seeing that media story, like a news story on the television, they didn't know that you could do that. And they were like, wait, I could just give my kidney to somebody and I don't even have to know them and you can do that. And literally as soon as they heard that you could do that, they wanted to do it. And they might have gone through some research, like, okay, now that I want to do this thing, like what are the risks and how does it work and et cetera. But the initial decision to donate, most of the report is like, yes, I want to do this. It wasn't like this considered hemming and hawing process. So, anybody watching this, like, if you're going to donate a kidney to a stranger, you've probably already decided to do it. Like, if you haven't decided you want to do it by now, you're not going to.
Wait, so what do these people turn out to be like?
Say that again.
What do these people turn out to be like?
So, to some extent, like people who were on the low end of the empathy spectrum, they're very different from one another, and you wouldn't necessarily know that they're different from other people. Although I would say that they do seem, as a rule, extremely nice, right? And so maybe this is an interesting difference between people who are on the low end versus the high end of the spectrum. Is the people who are on the low end, it's in their interest to make sure that you can't tell, right? And so they're actively trying to make sure that they seem normal, even a little bit abnormal. People who are at the high end of the spectrum, they're not trying to conceal it, right? Certainly. I don't think they're trying to amp it up either, but they're just being themselves. And I think who they are as themselves is really unusually nice. They do seem just like kind people who really, really care about others. And it's really been sort of amazing that way.
It's hard for all of these tropes that we see in the movies. Because first of all, it seems like the Darth Vader thing is turning out not to be true. But then also, it seems like we have this Casablanca kind of idea that there's going to be this person who's like the bad boy all the time, seems so tough, but then at the very last moment when people really are depending on it, it's that person who actually steps up to make the enormous self-sacrificial move. But it turns out the people doing the enormously self-sacrificial thing are just the incredibly nice people who just act really nice all the time. Does that turn out to be it?
I think a couple of the people that we brought in who were definitely not really expressive, right? They might be very sort of self-contained. They weren't gushy or sentimental at all. But then, when push came to shove, they really wanted to do this thing to help somebody else, and maybe they weren't being overly expressive about it, but that same very deep desire was there. So I would say there was quite a range in that sense. We had, when we talked to people about their donations in many of the interviews, people were very emotional thinking back to it, and there were tears, but definitely not for all, right? For other people, they were, I think to a person remembered the experience as something that they would absolutely do again, right? If they could choose to make the decision or not all over again, they would. I think 100% of them say yes, they would do it again. But for some, it was a very emotional experience to think about it, and for others, it was just more matter of fact.
Did you use this neuroimaging approach on them as well? Did you also put them in the scanner? Did you put these people also in the fMRI scanner?
Yes. So sorry, we brought them into the Georgetown MRI suites and did both functional and structural brain imaging scans on them. I think we kept them in the scanner for over an hour. It was a long day. And we also did a lot of behavioral tests with them. Behavioral tests including things like IQ, just to make sure that they were similar to the controls we brought in, and then other tests that we were looking to see if they were different from controls, like do they self-report experiencing more empathy? Are they better recognizing fearful facial expressions behaviorally? And what we found from the MRI scans is that, like we hypothesized, they look like the opposite of psychopaths. So the people who are psychopathic show too little amygdala response to fearful expressions in the scanner, whereas the altruistic kidney donors showed more than average, right? They showed a bigger amygdala response than controls. In addition to that, they had bigger amygdala than the controls, whereas psychopaths tend to have smaller amygdala. And at least in one study of adult psychopaths, they had, I think, 17 or 18% smaller amygdalas than controls, which is a big difference. Whereas the altruists had 8% bigger, right, amygdalas than controls. What was really interesting about them is they actually also had bigger brains. Like their whole brain is just bigger, which that was not what we predicted at all. But even after controlling for the bigger brain, they had bigger amygdalas than controls. So they seem to have just these big, healthy, active amygdalas compared to the little shriveled ones that people who are psychopathic have. And in addition, they were better at recognizing fear in the behavioral task. And there was a nice relationship between how responsive their amygdala was to fear and how good they were at recognizing it. So really at least in terms of these three things that we were looking at, they look like anti-psychopaths. They look like the people who are on the other end of this compassion or caring continuum.
What I really like about this study is that outside of the theory, it's not anything you ever have predicted. So if you're just thinking, I wonder what makes people give away a kidney, you wouldn't think, these are going to be the people who are especially good at recognizing fear faces. Like, it makes sense in light of the larger theory that's coming out of psychopathy research. But if you were just thinking about kidney donation, you wouldn't say, the main test we should run is ability to recognize fear faces.
Right. No, it makes sense in light of what we already know about psychopathy. And I often get asked, why fear? Why is it sensitivity to fear? Why not sensitivity to sadness or pain? And the first answer I always give is, well, it just is. Like, it's not, that's just the empirical fact, that your sensitivity to other people's fears seems to be a good marker of how you'll behave toward them if we give you real situations, right? Whether you're low in sensitivity to other people's fear and you act terribly in the real world, or you're extra sensitive to people's fear and you seem to act extra altruistic in the real world. I do think that there's something about fear that seems to elicit empathy more than other kinds of cues, because it is this very acute sign of need, and even the appearance of fear is very vulnerable, and I think we may be really predisposed to respond empathically to that cue. That's my guess. But what's interesting is that, we also looked at people's self-reported empathy, right? So we asked them using a standard empathy scale, how much empathy do you feel for people on average? And what was kind of funny was that the people who were the kidney donors didn't have higher empathy scores, at least in our initial imaging sample, than controls, right? They didn't self-report being more empathic. And yet, they were more altruistic, and they were also more empathic in this sensitivity to other people's fear metric. And so it leaves this interesting question of like, well, what's real? Are they more empathic, right? If they don't self-report more empathy, but they are more empathic in terms of sensitivity to fear, what's the right answer? And I would say, well, what's real empathy? I would say it's the surreptitious nonverbal sensitivity measure is more important than how much empathy you self-report, I think.
So maybe just explain some of the kind of worry that people have about empathy as being really the key to these things. But some people think, maybe it's not really all about empathy. Maybe it's more about reasoning or self-control. It's really those people who are going to help other people. Maybe this idea of these highly emotional, sentimental people who are supposed to be so good, maybe that's all a farce. But it could be that it's not all a farce. That's what's happening is just that really having those emotions does lead you to do nice things. It's just that our sense of who has those emotions is completely mistaken. If you ask someone of all the people you know who most has those emotions, they're not going to tell you the people who really have those emotions. They're going to tell you the people who are the best actors. You know, the people who
show them.
Yeah.
Which is not a perfect currency for people who actually have. And I was saying, and this is very consistent with the social psychology literature, is that we're not always that good at knowing how much, of an emotion we're feeling. We're not always perfectly in tune, and we're certainly not always that attuned to how much of it we feel relative to other people. We're always just guessing, right? Because we're comparing how we feel inside to what we see other people showing outside. And all of these self-report measures are asking you to implicitly compare yourself to other people, right? Do you feel, concern or compassion for people a lot or a little? Well, what's a lot or a little? It kind of depends on how much you think other people feel. So, there was one participant we had who self-reported experiencing very little empathy, like almost the bottom of the scale, who was a kidney donor. Right. And he said, he would tell us in interviews, so like, I don't think I'm a very empathic person. But when we looked at his other data, it actually turned out that he had the best ability to recognize fear of any of our subjects. He was he had a really, really high score. And so that suggests that he is empathic in some sense. It's just that's not how he perceives himself to be. And yet he seems to be empathic in the important way that seems to be related to actual altruism.
So maybe in part, people's tendency to report being empathic has to do with how sincere they think people are. That if you think of other people in general as being incredibly sincere, you're going to say that you're very low in empathy. Because you think, well, I feel so much less than everyone else.
Right.
But if you think of everyone else as being very insincere, then you're, well, they appear to be this,
right,
but they're really this, and then I'm intermediate between this, but I'm actually feeling much more than any of them are.
That's right. That's right. There is this really interesting interaction between how much you actually feel and how honest you are in your own displays of emotion. And if you tend to assume that the correspondence between your own external displays and internal feelings is the same for everybody, yeah, you might assume that people who seem really gushing over the top feel way more than you if you're not a very expressive person, because you think that they have that same correspondence, but maybe they don't, right? And so maybe you're like, well, I know how I feel towards other people in trouble, but I think other people feel even more, so I think I'm kind of low down.
So we should wrap up at this relatively soon. Before we go, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we can do with all this knowledge that you're providing. So it seems like the key thing coming out of it is a lot that what predicts whether someone's really going to help you out when you're in trouble is whether they actually have these feelings. But that everyone's trying to act like they have these feelings. Maybe the psychopaths are even just doing a better job of acting like they have these feelings. So when we're really trying to decide who to have as our friends and so forth, what should we do? Should we give people pictures of fear faces and try to ask, can you guess this emotion?
So I suppose you could be sneaky about it, right? You could, like just put on a little, make your voice sound afraid. Because it turns out you see the same patterns whether you look at vocal fear or body fear or facial fear, whatever. And so, you could do a little test where, you're like, I'm not too sure about this friend I've got. And so I'm just going to act a little bit nervous and see if they can figure out how I'm feeling.
But is that what you actually do? Maybe, do you have anything that we really could do in a situation like this?
Say that again.
Do you actually do that? I mean, do you have any suggestions about something we really could do when we're in this kind of situation?
I have never done this myself. I think, it pays to look at people's patterns of it's sort of a truism in some way. It's not a terribly original idea, but the idea that you can tell something about a person much better by watching what they do over time rather than just taking their word for what kind of a person they are, or by getting suckered in by their outward displays of what kind of a person they are, because those are really easy to put on. And almost every psychopathy researcher has at least one story of being suckered in by somebody who they thought, was like, they seem so legitimately nice. I just can't believe they're not actually that nice. And then something bad happens because you get suckered in by it. But if you, and one of the ways you have to do interviews for people who are psychopathic is you can't just take their word for it, right? You can't, for a clinical interview for depression, you can just talk to the person who has depression about how they're feeling because you assume you can take their word for it. But if somebody is psychopathic, you can't take their word for it. because, they're often very deceitful. That's one of the criteria. And so you're supposed to look at file information, which means, if they're in an institution or a prison, look at their record. Like, does what they say fit with what they do? Or if they're a kid, talk to their parent. Like, is the kid's story, does that line up at all with the parent's story? And I'm thinking of the one case that we, when I was at NIH, got almost suckered in by somebody who just seemed so sweet, so legitimately sweet. And we just couldn't believe that, she was so bad as her mother said. And we're like, these two things don't line up at all. And so we ended up calling somebody else who knew her well and going through all these stories. And we were like, whoa, we almost totally missed this person who was really problematic. And just not, knowing that people outsides and insides may just not match up that well. And you have to be careful to look at how they really act. This is especially true for romantic relationships. I mean, these are often the saddest stories of psychopathy, is people who, are this person is charismatic and they have fun together and it's exciting, and there are all these little stories they tell that don't quite add up, and sometimes they, are gone and it's not clear where they are, and, or stolen goods show up in their home and they're like, why are all these phones in the corner? And then they're gone. I mean, these are the stories people tell. And, there's a great book out there called The Gift of Fear, that, pay attention to this stuff because it's telling you something, and you got to look beyond the charisma, look beyond, somebody's description of what they're like. And, you have to see what they really like as a person.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Absolutely.